In this course, we'll look at two advanced features for project costing: indirect costs and effective labor rate. We'll look at the concept of indirect costs, and then we'll look at the basic setup required to get the indirect cost functionality working, and then we'll work with them in project transactions. In effective labor rate, we'll look at the concept of effective labor rate. We'll look at the basic setup required to get effective labor rate working, and then we'll run through some examples of how effective labor rate works in project transactions. The costs of a project-based organization can be broken down into two major classifications: direct costs, which examples would be direct project labor, the hours that people work on a project, and direct project expenses, say the cost of traveling to and from the client site. Direct costs would be entered as timesheets or expenses, and then there's indirect costs. Indirect costs are costs that contribute to the overall operation of an organization but are shared among departments or projects. It's otherwise known as general and administrative expenses. Examples of these would be office rent, office supplies, IT services. Some organizations would like to use these shared indirect costs when evaluating the financial performance of projects. In the project module in AX, indirect costs can be used, the feature indirect costs can be used to accomplish this. The indirect costs feature consists of individual elements or components that are typically calculated as a percentage of direct labor or as an hourly rate. These rates can then also be passed along not only on the cost side, but on the customer side through invoicing or through accruals of revenue. The percentages and rates used for computing indirect costs can be different compared to the percentage of the rates used for computing indirect accrued revenue and indirect billings. Within the product itself, the concept of indirect costs starts with the indirect cost component group. Within that component group, indirect cost components, such as legal expenses or office supplies or whatever the component part that you want to identify, is assigned to the groups. Inside the components also is assigned a special indirect cost component category. We'll take a look at this, but it's as you've seen, categories drive a lot of the posting behavior of project, and there's a special category that needs to be set up for indirect costs components. Indirect cost component groups also contain compounding rules in terms of if you want to have one indirect cost be attributable to another indirect cost, as well as the calculation methods that you use to calculate the indirect cost, either based on a unit or a percentage of a base amount or compounded amount. Once you've set up your component groups, you assign it to a project. There can only be a one-to-one relationship between a group to a project. Indirect cost components are the representations of the indirect costs, such as rent, office supplies, or utility expense. Let's talk about the setup required to create them. You define an ID, a name, and assign a project category to the component. Let's talk about the project category for indirect cost components. As with the rest of project accounting, you need to define a category so that costs and sales can be posted to the ledger. You create a special category for indirect costs to use when posting these indirect costs. The category is created in the same manner as other project categories of the transaction type hour, as the indirect costs are computed on the basis of labor hours or labor amounts. The only difference is there's a special checkbox called indirect cost component. This specifies the categories for use in indirect costs and also does not allow it to be directly chosen either through a timesheet or an hour journal. Indirect cost component groups are the vehicle used to group these indirect cost components together, also to assign calculation methods, rates, compounding rules, and then to assign them to a project. You assign the cost components that we just spoke about to a component group. Not all components that you have need to be associated to a group, and you can have multiple groups reusing the same components. Each group is an independent unit containing different calculation methods, rates, and compounding rules. Again, there's a one-to-one relationship, though, between a group and a project. A project can only have one indirect cost component group. There are two types of calculation methods that can be applied to a component within an indirect cost component group. This is unit rate and percentage. The basis of a unit rate component is predefined to be labor hours entered either through timesheet or through hour journals. For example, you could apply a $10 per hour indirect cost for office supplies. So whenever an hour is posted through a timesheet or an hour journal, a $10 per hour overhead cost would be applied to that transaction. The second calculation method is percentage. Percentage is defined as a percentage of a base amount on the transaction for the overhead charge. Another thing you can do with the percentage as the calculation method is that you can apply compounding rules. So you can apply the percentage to the base amount, then you can also apply compounding where you apply the percentage to the base amount plus any other cost component. Another feature is that you can pass indirect costs along to customers in T&M projects and also apply different rates. Again, once you define your project group, then you assign it to your projects. Again, it's a one-to-one mapping. Let's take a look inside the system and see how this stuff actually manifests itself. So let's create some indirect cost components and a component group. In the area setup page, there's an indirect cost node. We'll start with the components. We'll create components for office rent, office supplies, shared IT, and shared legal expenses. We'll create office rent first. Again, we need to assign a category to it. We've defined an indirect cost category. You could define multiple ones of these and have different account mappings for them. Let's take a quick look at what that category actually looks like. So again, we look at this, it's the same as any other hour category, except for this indirect cost component flag is flagged. Now it won't appear in any timesheet or hour journal. Other than that, it's a mandatory worker hour transaction type category. So let's go back, we'll create the rest of our category. Expand this so it's a little easier to see. So now I've finished creating my components. Next step is to create the component group and assign these components to it. So I said before, we can create multiple component groups and reassign these components to it numerous times. So we'll create a new one called overhead. So once I name it, now here's where I assign the components to it. So let's make this a little bigger so we can see it all. So again, it's an effective date sort of thing. We'll use, let's go and we'll use first of the year. A little bit bigger. So now here's the components that I've set up. Let's start, we'll have office rent. And then we'll pick a calculation method. For this one, let's use unit-based. We'll give it a rate. So let's call it a $2 per unit charge. And we'll also put an invoicing rate on it. So whenever I post an hour, either through a timesheet or through an hour journal, if I have this overhead cost component group assigned to my project, it's going to add another $2 per unit onto the cost rate for office rent. And then whenever I invoice it to a customer, it would add $2 onto that invoice. I can use different rates. I can leave it 0. Here I'm going to leave revenue at 0. This would apply if I'm using revenue accrual. So let's add another one. We'll add office supplies. Let's leave office supplies as a percentage. So I'm going to say 1% of the base amount will be applied for office supplies to any posting. And on the invoicing side, we'll have 2%, which brings up the topic of compounding, which is the question of what is this being applied to. So we need to go to the compounding cost side, and this is where we say this is what that 1% and 2% applies to. For this one, I'm going to use the base amount, so the amount of the transaction. And then I'm also going to do that on the invoicing side. I'm going to say the base amount. So what I've done here is I've said for the base amount of the transaction, I'm going to apply 1% on the cost and 2% of that base amount on the invoicing. And I can click on this other button called Model Rates and see what the effect of this is. So for any $100, this is my base amount, or any hour, I'm going to apply $2, and then I'm also going to apply 1% of that 100 or 2% of that 100, and you can see what my total is. So with this form, I can model my rates in terms of I can change these amounts and hit calculate and see what the cost and the invoice of this indirect cost is going to be. So let's continue. We will add our shared IT. Let's call shared IT as 3% on both. We'll do the compounding rules. Shared IT is also going to be based on the base amount. And now let's do the overhead shared legal. Let's do 5%. Oops, not 50%. Now let's make this more interesting in terms of the compounding rules. We will use the base amount as well as shared IT. So it will apply the 5% to the base amount plus then whatever shared IT is. We'll do that same on the invoicing side. Base amount, then shared IT. Let's take a look at what that does when we model the rates. Now you notice I put in that shared legal was 5%, but remember it was 5% of the base plus the shared IT piece. So instead of being a strict $100 base amount times 5%, it's actually a little bit more. And the math of that is that it takes the 100, applies the 3% on the base for shared IT, that gives me $103, and then it applies 5% on top of that, which gives me 3% of $103 is $5.15. So with this, you could have different cost components at different rates that also then one rate applies to another rate, and you can compound and do all kinds of fancy things. So the last piece of the setup is that we need to assign this to our projects. Now I can, if I was to set this up, this would apply the indirect cost to every project in my system. For this example, I've already pre-baked a project. We'll assign it to this project. So let's take a look at the effects of this setup on both the cost transactions and on invoices. So we've done our setup. Let's go back to the project side. And I've already created an indirect cost project. This project is in process. Currently, I have no postings. So it's a brand new project ready in process. So let's post an hour journal and see what happens. So for May, we'll do some project management work. Have our worker Yoichiro do 40 hours. Now if I go and look, you can see that he's got a cost price of $200 per hour and a sales price of $350 per hour. So let's post it. Now let's look at the project transactions page. Now you can see that you'd expect a $40 or 40-hour transaction with $200 per hour. You'd expect to have an $8,000 cost amount, but you can see we've actually got a little bit more, and that is due to, if we scroll over, our indirect cost components. So if we drill into this transaction, you can see that it's added, so it shows me that I've got 40 hours at $200, but then I've also added indirect costs to it. So here's my indirect cost piece, and then here's what the total amount of the cost is. You can also see on the sales side that it's calculated an indirect cost amount of this, and the total sales amount would be that. I can also look at the ledger updates, which also shows me where my indirect costs went. There's also a button here that shows me then here's my rates and here's the amounts and here's where how I added up what my base amount was, what my sales price was, and then what the individual rates and amounts that were added to the figures are. So we've looked at the cost side. Remember, we also set it up for the invoicing side. So let's go and run an invoice proposal. And you can notice here also on the invoice proposal creation form, we've got indirect costs showing up here. We create the proposal. You can see that we have an indirect components button. Again, we can see this same form where it will show me how the calculation of how this indirect cost amount was calculated. We post it, and the invoice is posted.